Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible comes together to fulfill the story of God.
In today's episode, we're talking about Abraham, specifically his call. The story of Abraham is found in the book of Genesis, and actually his story goes on for 13 chapters. It begins in chapter 12, and he dies in chapter 25. So we're not going to cover all of that today, obviously. And what we're going to be looking at actually goes up to chapter 21. You're thinking, well, that's still a lot to cover, but we're going to focus in on specific parts of the story today as we look at Abraham.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about today's episode, and I was writing, and a question popped in my head. I'm like, who's the most important person in the Bible? Like a tier list or something of like who had the biggest impact. And obviously my number one was Jesus, but number 2, 3, and 4, or your top 3 other than Jesus, most important. I wanted to ask you guys what you think. What were your top 3 most important or impactful characters?
Yeah, so, okay, so I'm leaning towards, obviously, Ehud, the left-handed judge.
Oh, yes, that's a good one.
I'm actually I'm joking, obviously. It came up this weekend. I was at a retreat this weekend, a youth retreat, and the youth were asked to act out a story in the Bible, and I had the high school boys, who happened to be a group that were like homeschooled too, and so sure enough, Ehud came to the service, and that's what they wanted to act out.
Were you the fat king?
I was not the fat king, actually. Thanks for that observation, Fletcher. I actually didn't take part in. I oversaw, but I thought it was hilarious that was the story that came to mind. Obviously, not the most important character in the Bible, but I do think that the book of Judges reveals something very important throughout the Bible. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and just say the book of Judges as being very important.
That's a little bit
because of the line that repeats throughout. It says the people were without a king and they did what was right in their eyes. Right. And so I think that just highlights the importance of Jesus as king. Obviously, Jesus, number 1. Book of Judges is my number 2. I think Moses is pretty important. And I'm also going to cheat and say today's guy, nice. Abraham, nice. And we'll talk more about that. So I'm a big cheater, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I feel like that now my answer is, I don't know, inadequate or something.
My answer was Jesus, and then obviously we're writing today's script about Abraham. He's the father of Israel. And then I thought about Moses. And then I was talking to my wife about it, and she goes, what about David? And I go, oh, yeah, he's pretty important,
too, yeah.
King of Israel. So I think Abraham, David, and Moses. It was my answer.
Okay.
Abby, if you want to give one.
Yeah, Jesus, yeah. We're just going to make it obvious, Jesus. And then, yeah, Abraham, he's the father of, like, all the 12 tribes, right? So you can't really say that, well, Jacob, but still, like, you can't say that. He's just everybody. So Abraham. And then I also put Mary in there because, like, without her, Jesus wouldn't be born. Like, I'm sure God would have found a way, of course, right. But she's kind of important. Yep. And woman power. And, yeah, Moses would probably be up there, too.
Yeah. And if any of you guys listening have anything to ask, you can email us at story@bfmc.org. Give us your opinions, give us your questions, whatever you want to say. Love to hear what you'd have to say.
Yeah, love to hear who you would say is the most important person in the Bible.
Besides Jesus.
It's funny that we all say that. It's like as if he's listening, and we're like, Jesus, just in case you're listening. Yeah. You're number 1. Important. These other people are behind you.
Actually, growing up, my family, when we had this game called Who Knew, and it wasn't Who Knew. Okay, whatever. There was this game, and there was an answer. You had to just, whoever could write the fastest. So it could be like, what's this person's favorite actor, or what's this person's favorite? And if you put Jesus, you actually, like, you lost points because everybody's like, it's obviously everybody's always going to put Jesus. So we had the Jesus rule, and you couldn't just put Jesus for everything.
Like the Sunday school answer.
Yeah.
Like, it's right, but I want more.
Yeah, exactly. Who would you want to meet when you die? Jesus. Okay, we all know you'd want to meet Jesus.
All right. So as for some background of Abraham, I have this picture in my head when I think of Abraham. He's just some guy in the middle of the desert with some sheep and some goats. But he came from a time, he's about 2000 BC. We said this last week, but around 2000 BC. And he's in the ancient Near East. He's in Mesopotamia, which is modern Turkey and Iraq. But he's from this time where there's these huge cities. He's in the Bronze Age, and it's a lot of people. It's more than what I think of just wandering in the desert. He came from this huge, huge civilization. There's lots of history from Egypt and Mesopotamia and in the land of Canaan that he's from. So just a bit of historical background on Abraham. He's born in a Sumerian city called Ur and moved to Haran with his family when he was young. And we don't really know where Ur is, but it's probably in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Turkey. They're both polytheistic, which means they have multiple gods. And they had moon gods and a whole pantheon of other gods. So this family wasn't monotheistic in any sense. They were worshippers of tons and tons of different gods. So you think of Abraham, he talked to God, but he didn't grow up with one God only, which is pretty cool because what he accomplished.
Right. It kind of, like, for me, I think of that as like, what we uncover in this is that God got Abraham's attention, right? Which makes me ask who else was he talking to? And why didn't they pay attention, or what did they get wrong in that? And I mean, as we look at Abraham, maybe we'll even uncover some of that, but yeah, it's interesting. Abraham is he's the guy who he responded to God getting his attention. It's kind of neat.
There's these Jewish stories that are in the what's it called,
Midrash,
about Abraham as a child, and he'd smash his father's idols because he was this great man. But those are kind of written after the fact and probably aren't historically accurate. So we kind of get this thing that Abraham was just a regular guy. He wasn't some great man, or like Noah was considered righteous. But at the time, Abraham, or Abram as he was called, was just a regular guy. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think we need to be okay with that too. Like I remember teaching this in Bible school, and the students having such a difficult time wrapping their head around the fact that Abram at the time, like you say, was actually an idol worshiper. It came from he was a pagan, worshiping pagan gods, and God called him out of that. And it's so interesting that we would have such a hard time with that, because we are pagans called out of our worship of pagan gods into a relationship with Jesus, and that really just highlights what you're driving home here, is that Abraham was a regular guy. Like he's just a regular guy doing regular things for his time. And the story that we see is meant for us to receive as an invitation to respond to God and to step into the things that he places before us.
All right. So right before we get into the story, Abby's going to give us a little bit of a context, geographical wise, of where this is taking place, so we can kind of picture it in our heads on a map of what the world looks like.
Yeah, so Fletcher did a little bit talk about Turkey and Iraq. And so it's funny because I always think about early Bible times being more towards like Israel, of course, and whatever, and Egypt and whatever. But how much of the Middle East actually does have this rich biblical history? And we kind of ignore it, I think, because of other religions and other groups of people that we don't always want to associate ourselves with anymore. And so it's cool to remember that, you know what, a lot of the starting places, they have some of the oldest, not just biblical history, but world history and geography. And so, yeah, so this is in Mesopotamia, which Fletcher did specify is in like southern Turkey, northern Iraq, and Ur, which is the one of the Abraham's areas, is also in northern Iraq. And Canaan, Shechem, and Bethel are all in modern-day Israel, and then the Jordan Valley, which you can still look up on your own map. You can go onto Google Maps. It's one of my favorite things to do, and just figure out where they are and just go look it up and see, okay, this is actually how far they were from each other. It was near the Dead Sea. And then Egypt, that's still Egypt.
Yeah. Egypt is one of like the oldest civilizations in the world, and they're along the Nile River.
I wonder why their name didn't change.
Right, I was just thinking that, like, Egypt is the kind of it's a constant throughout.
Yeah.
And And I mean, maybe there's symbolism there for us to uncover as we look at Moses' story at another point in time. But Egypt is constant and present, so something to chew on. But in the midst of that, we got this regular shepherd guy with his wife, kind of just wandering around, and it's interesting too. Like as you mentioned, there were great civilizations, lots of kings, and we'll see later on in his story that he has interactions with all these different kings as well. And he's just this insignificant guy, and he really is insignificant because it's just him and his wife, no kids, no family, nothing going on. But he's just this guy walking around in his culture, and God somehow gets his attention, and that's what we're gonna dive into today.
Yeah. I'd even highlighting insignificant even one more time. You can't place him in archaeology. Nobody can find Abraham because he was just this regular guy and he founded these nations.
Right.
So he's impossible to trace. He's just a guy. He wasn't a civilization. He created one, but he's just a guy. So let's get into it.
All right, let's learn about this just a guy.
So Abram, not Abraham yet. His name is Abram. So he's the son of Terah. He's from a place called Ur. So it starts off giving a little genealogy of Abram and his father.
Hold on, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm just thinking, like, so you said Abram, not Abraham. Is there something there that we need to uncover? Like, what does Abram mean
versus Abraham?
Yeah.
Well, I know what Abraham means, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I don't know what the difference is between Abram and Abraham.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't have interrupted then. No, but well, Abram means father.
Okay.
And then Abraham,
father of many,
right. Or great father. So, yeah.
Cool. Anyway, we introduce Abram, and God shows up in the very first verse of chapter 12 of Genesis. It's God appeared to Abram, and he tells him to go to Canaan. And he says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And all people on earth will be blessed through you. And Abraham does what he's told. He believes God, and he takes his wife, he takes his nephew, and all their possessions, and they go to Canaan. So they lived in Haran, which is in northern Iraq, and they go all the way down to Canaan, which is in modern-day Israel. So it's a decent journey. He takes all their possession and he leaves. Then he goes to a place called Shechem. Do you know how to pronounce that?
I am not. I am.
I just try.
If I'm anyone in this podcast, I am not the biblical pronunciation guy.
Shechem. Anyway, it's in the land of Canaan, and God tells him he'll give this land to his offspring. And then Abram sets up an altar to God there. And then he goes to Bethel and prays to God, and he sets up another altar. Now, this is where things kind of go wrong. So he listened to God. He went to where he was told. But there was a famine, so there's a problem. So what do you do when there's a famine? There's no food. You go somewhere else. So they got a little scared, so they go south to Egypt. And a nickname for Egypt is like the bread basket, because in the Nile, it's always there. There's always food in Egypt. If you notice, in any time there's a famine in the Bible, oftentimes they go to Egypt because there's lots of food. So now, while they're in Egypt, Abram gets a little scared that his wife is so beautiful. I have the same problem.
I definitely, same.
But he ends up lying to the Egyptians and telling the Pharaoh that Sarai, who's his wife, is actually his sister, which gets him into trouble because the Pharaoh ends up marrying Sarai, and God puts this curse on the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh goes, why am I being cursed? I didn't do anything wrong. And he finds out that Sarai is actually his wife and kicks him out.
Yeah,
he goes,
as he should.
Yeah,
right? Like,
why'd you lie to me? There's no reason to lie to him, but he did. He thought he was in danger, but he got treated well as his sister, but as Sarai was his sister. But then he found out, kicks him out of Egypt.
I'm just thinking of that, like, as you enter in, and obviously as you take a look back at the story, you're like, dude, what were you thinking? How did you think it was going to end? But not being familiar with the culture and everything, I have to ask myself, well, what would I have done differently? Because I don't know what I would have necessarily done differently. And then even as you're talking about this, and the famine causes him to move. The story doesn't say God said go to Egypt, and so I wonder if maybe the mess up even began in removing your faith from God. God said, "I will show you where to go." God didn't lead him to Egypt, and so there's a bit of a mess up even before the mess up with Pharaoh and Sarai and putting that out there. It's easy for me to say as I look back. I'm like, well, you should have just trusted that God would make it rain. Or
but when I have no food, I don't, am I going to put my trust in God? I hope so, but we have to figure it out.
Yeah. So again, that uncovers the regular guy. As a regular guy, he made decisions, and we see the ramifications of those decisions.
He believed God. He moved.
Yeah.
But then he kept moving. He wavered a little bit, I guess is what I want to say. So he ends up getting kicked out of Egypt. Where does he go? Back to where he was before at Shechem and Bethel. And we're going to have to jump ahead a little bit more because Abraham does have a lot of stories, and he's a big character, right? So we want to kind of focus on the main topic of Abraham being blessed. And I'm sure we'll talk about him and Lot a few times throughout this podcast because it's a fantastic story. So his nephew Lot and Abraham come back to the land of Canaan, and they're too close together. They have too big of a herds, too big of flocks, and too many servants, and they end up fighting. And Lot and Abraham, their kin, their family, they don't want to fight, so they end up separating. And Abraham says to Lot, "Where do you want to go? I'll go wherever you don't go." So you get the pick of the land, and Lot chooses the Jordan Valley for its lush land, lots of water, and it's a good place to live. But it turns out there's some other cities there, and Lot moves, and Abram goes over to where he was before in Canaan. So when he gets there, once they're all separated, God tells Abram, "Look to the north, look to the east, look to the south, look to the west. This land I will give to you and your children." So that's another blessing.
What children, God?
Yeah. So Abraham at this point has no children, which is a big part. So he goes, "I will give you this land to your children." And Abraham asks God, "I don't have kids. Is it going to go to my brother's kids? Is it going to go to my nephew? I have nobody to give it to." So eventually, Abram and Sarai getting old. They're up in the years, and they get impatient. And Sarai says, "You can go lay with my servant Hagar," and he does. And they end up sleeping together, and she ends up pregnant, and they have a son named Ishmael. And Ishmael ends up doing a lot of stuff, and we can't talk about it because we're running out of time. Right. But God makes good of the story of Ishmael, and it's really well done. Yeah.
Interesting thing about this. So this is mess up number 2 as we've got it listed out. And the interesting thing about this is Sarai had a servant named Hagar. And if we kind of look through the story and ask the question, well, where did the servant come from? The interesting thing is the servant actually came from mess up number 1. So they went into Egypt, and Pharaoh gave them livestock, herds, servants, both male and female. And so the result of the first mess up was that they had all of these things. One of these things was the servant, who was then offered to be an instrument in mess up number 2. Which, just the ramification of our decisions, and when we make poor decisions, when we make the decision to remove our trust from God, how does that carry with us into future decisions that we make in situations that we find ourselves in?
So they have a son. Abram and Hagar have a son named Ishmael, and Sarah isn't happy about that because it's not her son.
Right.
So that's a big mess up. We'll talk about Hagar and Ishmael another time, but we'll move on. So Abraham is now 99 years old, which is way older than I think I'm going to live, but I'm pretty young still, I guess. And God shows up again and tells him to walk with him and to be blameless. And then Abram falls on his face, and God gives him another promise. And this time it's in the covenant of circumcision. And God tells him that him and his descendants, if they keep this covenant, that he shall be the father of nations, and that kings will come from his line. And then God changes his name to Abraham and his wife's name to Sarah. And we talked about that earlier, but Abraham means the father of many.
Mm-hmm.
And God makes a promise that Sarai herself, who's 90 years old at the time, will bear a child next year, which is really cool. And they mess up a third time, and they fall on their face laughing and saying, yeah, right. I'm 90 years old. I'm not going to have a kid. Let the line go through Ishmael.
Right.
And God says, nope, even if it sounds impossible, keep this covenant and I will be, you'll have a son.
Mm-hmm.
And he follows it. He circumcises all his people, all his children, and follows the covenant that God lays out. And guess what? They end up having a son, and they name him Isaac.
Right.
And so God has followed through and given them a son.
Yeah, and God is showing through that the work is His. The covenant is His to actually do. And if you look
fulfill,
if you look at the covenant agreement, it's God doing all of the work. And we see Ishmael is a result of them doing the work themselves, trying to do it themselves, and God won't bless it.
Abraham really has the easy side of the thing to fulfill. He just has to believe God and uphold the covenant, and God will provide him with the rest, which I find is really
which
cool.
is what I love about Abraham as a story, which is why I think that it's the most important apart from Jesus, because it actually highlights the same thing that Jesus highlights, which is the work is His, and we actually have the easy thing in it, which, just in case you've been wondering or been journeying as a Christian, it doesn't seem all that easy. But the work belongs to the Lord, and our responsibility is to allow Him to do the work, just as Abraham's responsibility was to allow him to do the work. And when we see as they stepped out of that promise and tried to do it on their own, God wouldn't bless it. And when we step out of His promise to do the work in our lives and we try and do it on our own, we find a hard time finding and uncovering His blessings in that. And so we have God, and He promised three things to Abraham: that his descendants would have the land forever, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, and that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through his seed. And as we go through the story, and we'll see that the story continues on from Abraham all the way through, and we see this thread all the way through Scripture that leads to Jesus, who then becomes a blessing to the nations as well, and calls us to step into that promise to be a blessing to the nations as well.
And that's almost the topic that our podcast is following. We're following,
Right.
his descendants, his children are Israel, and then the land is Israel, or Canaan now it's called. But that's really the three things that we want to follow: is the people and the land and the blessing that comes from Abraham's line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's so important to remember, like, each person in the line. I was at an ordination and a baby dedication yesterday, and the father of the wife did the little dedication, and he went through the great-grandfather, the grandfather, the father of the baby, and then on both sides. And I thought it was so cool. He talked about, like, what their jobs were, how they prayed for the children, and how they lived a life according to God. And he went through it, and I was like, that's a really cool thing to do at a baby dedication, and just to constantly remember. And it's true, and I love that the Bible does do that. I know we talk about it in genealogies a lot, and that's kind of what this season is about, is genealogies. And so to have, like, the father of the major genealogy today is pretty neat.
Yeah.
I like the verse. I forget which chapter and verse it is, but it says that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So we talked about faith and walking with God last week with Enoch, and this is how Abraham walked with God: is he believed God. God made all these promises, and Abraham believed and followed God's instructions.
Yeah, that's in chapter 12 actually, where he's giving that blessing. And what's so neat about that is that God takes him out and says, "Look at the stars." And often what I'm reminded of in that is that the stars, we always think of the stars and think of night because that's when they're visible, but the stars are always there, right? And Abram is wrestling with the reality of God's promise. You've promised me this, but I don't have this. And God says, look at the stars. And so the reminder for me in that is that even when they're not visible, God's promises are still there, just like the stars. Even though they're not visible, they're there at all times. And so the reminder, again, just to focus in on what he has and to rest in what he has for us, because Abraham dies before he sees the fulfillment of all this, right? He's got his son, and his son's starting to start a family of his own, but also has some issues having children, and but he doesn't see the great nation. He dies without the fulfillment of that promise being realized, but he trusted in that promise.
All right. So that does lead to our final question. How does Abraham's story contribute to the story fulfilled of the Bible?
It's such a great question for Abraham, because he is really the beginning of the biblical story. He has these three big promises that take the entire Bible to really fulfill, right?
Yeah.
His children being Isaac and Jacob and Israel. And then you get to, the land and how it had to be conquered, and with Joshua and Moses. And then to all the nations of the earth the third blessing is all the nations of the earth would be blessed through you. And that's the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, and that's through Jesus. The whole world is blessed because of Jesus, and that's the biggest fulfillment there is, really, of the story.
Right.
So that's a great answer for the last one. The last thing we want to tackle is putting it on the timeline. So last week we had unanswerable, I guess, as our timeline near the beginning. This time it's easy to place, not easy. It's easier to place historically. It's around 2000 BC during the early Bronze Age, and it's really the birth of the Hebrew people. And Abraham truly is the father of nations. So thank you so much for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today.
I did
too. I had a great time. Great story. Hope to see you next time.
See you later.
Bye for now.